Okay, welcome to our new unit. This is going to be our longest unit. We're going to be covering contracts, and this first chapter, chapter 11 in your text, gives you some of the nature and the terminology of contracts. It gives you really an overview of the things that we're going to talk about through the next 9 or so chapters. We're going to this Unit 3 will include chapters 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. So let's go ahead and jump in because this is a foundational chapter. It's going to give us a little bit on what we need for just to understand the rest. Okay, so where does contract law come from? Well, there's really three places that you could say in the modern world that we can look back at and say, okay, here's where we can understand contract law and the concept of business law. First, of course, and this is true of most of the law, we would have to talk about the common law, what developed locally. Now, there's a little bit different here. Your book doesn't necessarily talk about some of these merchant courts or borough courts, but there was some contract law that came out of that, which legal scholars wouldn't necessarily call common law, but it shares a lot of the similarities. All right, having said that, what began to happen was different legislatures, including the 50 legislatures in the United States, and to some extent the Congress of the United States, began to enact statutory law, and all of this impacted the contract law. And then finally, administrative agencies, which really are creatures of the 20th century, were brought into being. And each one of these administrative agencies, particularly those engaged in the business sphere or the economic sphere, had an impact on contract law on business. So it's fair to say that contract law is a critical, if not the most critical part of the business law, of modern life in the business community. Contract law gives us stability. You're able to count on the idea that you can sign agreements with people, that these agreements will be recognized, that they'll be enforceable, and they essentially allow us to predict the future. They give us stability because we can look to the past. They give us predictability. We can look to the future for their enforcement. So we say, in our typical bad Latin that lawyers will talk, that pax sunt servanda, or pacta sunt servanda if you prefer, that agreements should be kept. So the underlying idea, again, now most Latin phrases are going to come out of the common law, is that all these agreements, if they fall within what we define as a contract, should be kept and enforceable. Okay, so how are we going to define what a contract is? In law school, one of the things that you do is you go forward and you study what are called restatements. These traditionally were very thick books that had compilations of information about different topics: real property, contract law, torts, criminal law, all these things. The second restatement of contracts gives a rather more lengthy definition. It says a promise or set of promises for the breach of which the law gives a remedy, or the performance of which the law in some ways recognizes a duty. Okay, it's not terribly clear to the average reader. The book really narrows it down a little bit more. A legally binding agreement between two or more parties who agree to perform or refrain from performing some act now or in the future. Again, a little bit wordy. I think it's a good definition, and I think as we develop more sophisticated vocabulary and understanding, I think that's one we can look to. But I think it's fair to start with my definition here, which is, what is a contract? An agreement that can be enforced in court. Now that of course means it's legal. That of course means it's binding. If it's an agreement, it's between two or more people. And an agreement to do something means you're going to perform or refrain performing something now or in the future because it becomes enforceable. But so my definition is the short and dirty one that you can start with and then build up to the book's definition. Okay. One of the questions that comes about is contract an objective or a subjective? That is, how do we know if a contract has come into existence? Well, you know, at first appearance, this might be silly. Don't people sign pieces of paper that say contract on them? They do. Contract for the sale of land, contract for the sale of cars. All of these things are written contracts. But sometimes you come across cases where people have engaged in activities. They maybe even exchanged pieces of paper, but there's no single piece of paper that says this is a contract. So generally, we like the objective theory of contract. Not subjectively from the people inside the dealing. We don't ask, well, do you think you were in contract? Well, I don't think I was. No, well, I think we were. We don't look at the two parties, if you call them, say, the buyer and the seller. Let's look at a reasonable person watching from outside. So a reasonable person seeing these two parties get together, talk to one another, make deals, would we agree or disagree that they formed a contract? Now, subjectively, okay, you can have your own point of view, your undisclosed point of view, but objectively, we'll ask questions like, what did you say? What did you do? What were the circumstances surrounding all the things you said and did? And taking these into account, we can say, yes, there is, or no, there isn't a contract. All right, now, I list here the 6 elements of contract. Now, your book calls them 4 elements and 2 defenses. That's fine. You can look at it that way, but you need to keep these 6 things in your mind. If you want to call the last 2 defenses, that's absolutely okay. But in law school, when I was studying, and admittedly this was 30 years ago, we just called them the 6 elements of contract. Now, each one of these, agreement, consideration, capacity, legality, assent, form, are things that we're going to look at in separate chapters, or sometimes combined with a couple others. But these are all going to be present, so they're very, very important. For example, chapter 12 in our text is agreement. Chapter 13 is consideration. Chapter 14 is capacity and legality. And then we get to some defenses like mistake, fraud, consent. That'll be chapter 15. Then we're going to get to writing requirements. After that, we'll move on. But you can see how critical these 6 elements are of a contract. So, very quickly, keeping in mind that we are going to look at these in much greater detail. An agreement is sometimes broken down into 2 parts. An offer, and let's just take the simplest offer you can think of. Let's just talk about selling a car. Offer: will you buy my car for $1,000? Acceptance: yes, I will buy your car for $1,000. Now you notice those offers are being made verbally. They could be written. They could be performance. Here, buy my car. Okay, here's your money. Now, consideration. Consideration is what is being exchanged between the 2 parties, the buyer and the seller. And I'm going to use buyer and seller as shorthand here. 99% of the time, on one side is money. Sometimes it's not money. Most of the time it is on one side. The other side can be goods. It can be services. It can be the surrendering of a legal right to which you have the ability to enforce. forbearance. So we use a term, here's some more Latin for you. We use the term quid pro quo, this for that. You give me this, I give you that. And if you think about the simplest thing you can do, I mean, we could go back to our example of the car. Will you give me your car for $1,000? Yes, I'll sell my car for $1,000. You give him the cash, he gives you the car. Quid pro quo. The third element, or part, is capacity, contractual capacity. Obviously, not everybody can enter into a contract. Think about a very young child, a child that is 3 or 4 years old. Would you say, well, they can enter into contracts? I mean, why can't they sell something they own or give up the legal right to something? Well, you would say they lack the ability. Now, we are going to assume, and this is a presumption of the law, more about what a presumption is in a second, that everyone has the capability of understanding a contract. Now, under the law, presumptions are typically rebuttable or non-rebuttable. This is a rebuttable presumption. We're going to assume you have contractual capacity, but evidence can be presented that rebuts or strikes down this presumption, the end result of which is you do not have capacity. If you lack capacity, you can't enter into contract. If you can't enter into contract, then there is no contract. All right, the fourth element is legality. Legality means that the subject matter of the contract is lawful. Will you buy my car for $1,000? Yes, I will buy your car for $1,000. Is it legal to pay money for a car? Yes, it is. Is selling cars legal? Yes, it is. Therefore, we're okay. But suppose I said, will you buy my illegal drugs, whatever drug you want to put in there, for $1,000? Will you buy my cocaine for $1,000? Yes, I'll buy your cocaine for $1,000. Well, we had offer, we had acceptance, we had consideration. We're going to assume that nobody's high at the moment, so we have capacity, but we don't have legality. The subject matter of the contract isn't lawful. And, worse than that, the contract can't be enforced. Because remember, one of the fundamental reasons we have contracts is so they can be enforced. Contracts that can't lawfully be enforced, they're no good. Now, sometimes it's not that they're illegal. It's sometimes that we don't concern ourselves with it. So let's suppose you say, hey, will you pick me up at the mall and drive me to the Best Buy? I guess there is a Best Buy at the mall. All right, will you pick me up at home and drive me to Best Buy? And I say, sure, I will. We had an agreement. And if I say, well, I'll pay you $10, great, I'll take $10. I'll be there to pick you up. We had capacity, but I didn't do it. Can you enforce this contract? That would be a difficult contract to enforce. So sometimes contracts are about a lawful subject matter, driving to the mall, but difficult to enforce. Now, the next two, and again, these two can be considered a little bit different than the four elements that we talked about previously, but it's really not critical to think of them that way. The fifth defense, or excuse me, the fifth element, or the first defense, if you prefer, is genuineness of assent. And we call that a meeting of the minds. Did the two parties really get together and agree to what was happening? So let's suppose I came to you and I say, will you buy my property that I own in Myrtle Beach for $100,000? And let's suppose you think I'm talking about a condo, and I think I'm talking about a commercial lot, a parking lot. Okay, you say, yes, I will. I will buy your property in Myrtle Beach. Well, we had consideration. Let's go back. Let me just go back here. We had an agreement, offer, we had an acceptance, we had consideration, we had capacity. It's legal to sell property. But the problem is, We didn't have a true meeting of the minds. We didn't agree as to what was actually being sold. We were confused. Therefore, we don't have a contract. The last requirement goes to form. Certain contracts have to be in certain forms. Now, typically what we're talking about here, and we're going to get to the writing requirement, that's going to be chapter 16. Typically what we're talking about is some contracts have to be in writing. Now, some contracts don't. Some contracts are enforceable even though they're oral, but some contracts have to be in writing. Some legal documents have to be in writing. If it's not in writing, then it's not enforceable. There are a few other ways of forms of contracts. Sometimes contracts have to use particular things. A rare example I could think of is in North Carolina, contracts for the sale of land have to be under seal, which simply has been interpreted to mean that you can sign your name and after that put a parenthesis that says seal, S-E-A-L. Or you can get a nice piece of wax, a big stamp, and pretend you're a baron or a knight or something. Okay, let's talk about some of the types of contracts. Now, these types of contracts are not mutually exclusive. So I'm listing 4 here. Excuse me, I'm listing 6 here. Bilateral, unilateral, formal, informal, express, implied. So you could have a bilateral, formal, express contract. You can string these together. Only the terms taken together are mutually exclusive. So, bilateral. A bilateral contract is one in which there are 2 parties, and each party has promised the other. Typically, one is promised payment, another is promised a good or a service. A unilateral contract, there's 2 parties, but there's only one promise. And typically, a unilateral contract is completed by essentially performance. More about this in a little bit, because I believe, yeah, we got bilateral. Formal versus informal contracts. Formal contracts meet a statutory form requirement. Informal contracts are simpler in form. Express contracts are contracts that are complete. They're done. They're over. Usually an express contract means they've been reduced to writing. Implied contracts, they haven't been reduced to writing. They are often imposed or arise because of the behavior of the parties. So let's look at each of these. Bilateral versus unilateral. Bilateral contract. Each party makes a promise to the other party. You promise to paint my house, I promise to pay you. Unilateral contract. I put out a reward poster. Find my lost cat, I'll give you $100. Now the thing about a unilateral contract is the only way to complete it is not to say, okay, I will find your cat. That doesn't complete the contract. You got to actually produce the cat. So you got to do something. Now the problem with unilateral contracts, as you look at them, is under traditional contract law, you could revoke a contract at any time. What happens when someone begins to perform under a unilateral contract, but hasn't completed it yet? Suppose I say, I want you to bring me a kangaroo from Australia. So you say, okay, I'll go do it. You get on a plane, you fly to Australia, you get the kangaroo, you get the exit requirements. I don't know what it is, get a kangaroo out of Australia. And you're flying back to the United States and your phone rings and the guy says, I changed my mind, I don't want the kangaroo. Well, if it's a unilateral contract, can you do that? Well, modern contract law typically would stop you from saying you're going to be revoking your promise. And this can go to substantial reliance and promissory estoppel and a number of things. Now, it's called formal and informal. Formal contracts require a specific form or method to be valid. As I said, in North Carolina example is the contracts for the sale of land have to be under seal, and they also have to be written. Informal contracts, there's no requirement. It's very simple. You know, what's the formal structure of a contract to sell a ballpoint pen? There isn't one. You can do it orally, you can do it in writing. So formal versus informal. Pretty simple. Now, express and implied. Express contracts, 99.9% of the time, we're talking that someone has taken the contract and reduced it to writing. It's complete. You can look at it, you can say, this is it, this is everything, this is what I'm promising to do, this is what you're promising to do. Implied contracts, on the other hand, arise because of the way the parties act, or seem to arise because of the way they act. So there are certain conditions for implied contracts. One, that somebody, the person usually suing to enforce it, furnished a good or service. Okay, so they gave property or service. The second requirement is that when that's provided, one expects to be paid for it. It's not when I gave you a glass of water, you drank it, and I said, that'll be $100. I said, well, who charges for a glass of water? Well, I do. Well, that's probably got to kind of cut it. On the other hand, if you're sitting at a restaurant and you order a beer, people don't give away beer for free. You may not have expressly said, I will pay you for the beer, but someone provided a good or service, they expected to be paid, you had a chance to say, no, I don't want it, and you didn't. Okay, we can also look at a contract to see what stage it's in. Is the contract executed, or is the contract executory? An executed contract means that the contract has not yet been completed by each party. Excuse me, I reverse that. Executed means it has been complete by each party. So, will you pay me $1,000 for your car? Yes, I'll pay you $1,000 for your car. You give me the car, I give you the money, we're square. Everybody's done what they put. Now, executory means one or both haven't completed yet. So, will you give me $1,000 for your car? Yes, I will. Here's the $1,000. You now have $1,000 of my dollars. At this point, the contract is executory because I don't have the car yet. When you write out the bill of sale, when you write out the registration, now we're good. Now we've changed it to executed. We also can call a contract, and again, these are not, they're exclusive to each other, but they're not to some of the others. So you could have an express valid contract, for example. Okay, a valid contract is one that can be enforced. The buyer and the seller, that's typically how we look at contracts, can enforce it. A void contract can't be enforced by either side. So if I hired you to kill my wife, that is a void contract. If you killed her, you can't collect from me. If you didn't kill her, you can't get your money back. Okay? Or I can't get my money back. A voidable contract is one that can be avoided by one of the parties, but can be enforced against the other one. The most commonly one of these, the one that you're going to see this, is a contract with a minor. And we're going to talk about minority. But basically, you sign a contract with a 10-year-old. Well, they can get out of the contract because they haven't reached the age of majority yet. They really can't consent. This is not terribly common, but it is something to be concerned about. And then we have an unenforceable contract, which is typically one that's either void or voidable, a contract that can't be enforced. All right, quasi-contracts. We're coming down the home stretch. Got a couple more things like interpretation. But what's a quasi-contract? Well, quasi is Latin again. It means Quasimodo, for example. Hunchback of Notre Dame. You've all seen the movie, at least the Disney version, which, by the way, bears no relation to the book whatsoever. Quasimodo means ill-formed or partially formed. Quasi is just that, a contract that hasn't really been complete. So the classic example of a quasi-contract is Someone is injured in an accident, they're unconscious. They're taken to a hospital, they're giving treatment, their life is saved. They wake up and the doctor says, hey, I had to perform surgery, here's your bill. And the guy says, I never agreed to this. I am not going to pay. Well, the courts will actually compel him to pay. If you rendered medical assistance to an injured party, the courts will impose a quasi-contract. However, okay, if there already is a real contract or an express contract, it's not going to work. So let's suppose I had a contract with a doctor that said, you will provide all medical services for me for the year 2020. I get injured in November of 2020. The doctor, I'm unconscious, can't agree to a new price. The doctor performs a surgery, and he gives me a bill for $10,000, where our agreement was, I'll pay you $5,000 in case I ever need you this year. He couldn't enforce it. There'd be no quasi-contract. Also, let's suppose the doctor performs emergency surgery, saves your life. He can give you a bill for that. But let's suppose he says, nah, you know, this guy could really use a nose job, rhinoplasty. So I'm going to do that while he's unconscious. So he performs a rhinoplasty, not to save or help him, but simply because he thinks his nose is too large. He can't recover under that. The doctor can't. You get as much as you deserve. And we do this to prevent really one party getting unjust enrichment. If the benefit is unnecessary or arose out of negligence or misconduct, you don't get recovery. You cannot invoke a quasi-contract when one already exists. But the last big point we're going to talk about tonight is the interpretation of contracts. And this basically says that words are assumed to have their regular definition. Only if there is an ambiguous term or problem do we use external evidence, extrinsic evidence, outside the contract. So if I say I'm going to sell you my Buick for $1,000, well, we're going to assume Buick means a car. It's not some other weird definition of Buick. Only if, you know, if it's difficult to determine, do we go outside the contract and interpret it. So the first thing we do is what's reasonable, what's lawful, what's effective. But if that doesn't help us, we should look at the whole contract. Does the whole contract, taken together, explain what we're doing here? And if that's good, that's where we stop. If, however, there's some question, if the whole contract has a problem, then we can look at individual parts. So if we have a contract for someone to buy a car, okay, well, it's plain. But let's suppose I own 5 cars, and I didn't specify what car what specific car. I didn't put the VIN number down. But I own a Corvette, and I own 4 trucks. And in the contract as a whole, I talk about how I want to use the car to use the vehicle to race other cars. Well, there is truck racing, but if you take it as a whole, it seems pretty clear that the purpose there was to buy the car. If you've got negotiated separate parts, we can look at those as well, if they clear it up. Again, though, we always are going to assume that words have their regular meanings. Specific language controls over general language. If I say, I will sell you the car for a fair amount, and the blue book value of the car is $5,000, but later I give you specific language, the amount I'm going to sell it for is $1,000, specific would control over that general language. Now, the next one comes as a surprise to people, because sometimes a lawyer will say, why don't you go ahead and draft the contract? Why don't you draw it up? And people will say, wow, that's giving me an advantage. No, it's not. Because most people, if they're going to draft a contract, they will, somewhere in there, unless they're very good at it or it's a very standardized document, they are going to leave something ambiguous. If part of a contract could be, and having gone through the rest of that, can't tell from specific, can't tell from general, can't tell from the purpose, and you can't tell what it means, then, and you can interpret it two ways, one to the benefit of the buyer, one to the benefit of the seller. We say, okay, who wrote the contract? Well, the buyer wrote it. Then we err on the hand of the seller, because the buyer should have known what he was doing. Now, sometimes there's a conflict between what is handwritten in a contract, so you'll see someone like put in handwriting, versus what is typed or what is actually printed. And we take it in that order. If there's a conflict between what is written out in script or printed out by hand, that stands above what is typed in by a computer or a typewriter, or what has been printed on a standardized form. Again, though, the previous things would supersede it. If none of that helps, we look at evidence of past contracts and negotiations. Many states have laws requiring contracts to be in clear, coherent, and common words. North Carolina certainly tries all this, but frankly, it's very difficult to enforce plain language laws. All right, that keeps us right at about a half an hour. We'll end it there.